The thunder of hooves echoed across Sterling Ranch as the black stallion charged the fence, eyes wild with fury. Harrison Sterling stood on his mansion's balcony, watching another so-called horse whisperer flee in terror. For 3 years, no one had lasted 5 minutes with Diablo, the magnificent beast that had trampled 2 men and sent countless others running. $10 million in this entire estate, Sterling announced to the crowd below, his voice dripping with arrogance. That's my bet. Tame him, and it's all yours. The crowd murmured nervously until a weathered pickup truck rattled up the drive. Out stepped Jake Morrison, a simple farmer in worn jeans and muddy boots. But what nobody knew was that Jake had once been the military's top animal behaviorist, discharged after a classified incident that still haunted his dreams. As Jake approached the corral, something extraordinary happened. The stallion stopped charging. For the first time in years, Diablo stood perfectly still, as if recognizing something in this quiet stranger. What was Jake's secret, and why did this wild beast suddenly seem afraid of him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence stretched across the ranch like a taut wire. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as Jake Morrison stood at the fence line, his calloused hands resting on the weathered wooden rail. Diablo's nostrils flared, steam rising from his midnight coat, but the stallion remained motionless, a statue carved from shadow and muscle. Harrison Sterling leaned forward on his balcony, his expensive suit catching the afternoon sun. This wasn't what he'd expected. In 3 years, dozens of cowboys, trainers, and self-proclaimed experts had tried their hand with Diablo. Each had met the same fate, humiliation, injury, or both. Sterling had grown rich betting against them, his confidence as unshakable as his mansion's marble foundation. "Well?" Sterling called down, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Are you going to stand there all day, farmer?" Jake didn't respond. His steel-gray eyes remained fixed on the stallion, reading every twitch of muscle, every shift of weight. The crowd of onlookers, ranch hands, wealthy spectators, and a handful of reporters drawn by Sterling's outrageous wager pressed closer to the fence. Among them stood Maria Santos, Sterling's head trainer, the only person who'd shown any real progress with Diablo before the horse's descent into violence. She studied Jake with professional interest, noting something the others missed, the way he positioned his body, the careful control of his breathing, the almost military precision in his stance. "I've seen a lot of men try," she whispered to the reporter beside her. "But this one, there's something different about him." Jake reached into his jacket pocket, and several spectators stepped back instinctively. But he only withdrew a small leather journal, its pages yellow with age and stained with something that might have been blood. He flipped it open, scanning handwritten notes in multiple languages, observations, techniques, and protocols developed in places the world preferred to forget. Diablo's ears pricked forward, the first sign of curiosity rather than aggression anyone had witnessed from the stallion. The horse took a tentative step toward the fence, then another, drawn by an invisible force neither the crowd nor Sterling could understand. "Impossible," Sterling muttered, gripping the balcony railing. He'd paid $500,000 for Diablo, not for his gentle nature, but for his fierce independence. The stallion had been wild-caught in Nevada's mountains, already bearing scars from fights with wolves and rival stallions. Sterling had wanted a trophy, a symbol of untamed power to match his own ruthless business empire. Jake closed the journal and stepped through the fence gate. The crowd gasped collectively, but Diablo remained calm, his dark eyes tracking every movement. There was intelligence there, Jake realized, deeper than most people gave horses credit for. This wasn't just wildness, it was trauma, layered and complex as any he'd encountered in the military's classified programs. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, his voice barely audible. He moved with deliberate slowness, each step calculated to communicate safety rather than dominance. "I know what they did to you." The words seemed to unlock something in the stallion. Diablo's head lowered slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement that sent whispers through the crowd. Sterling's face darkened as he watched his supposedly untamable prize responding to a stranger in muddy boots. Maria Santos felt her pulse quicken. In all her years training horses, she'd never seen anything like this. The farmer wasn't using any conventional technique. No ropes, no treats, no show of force. He was simply communicating. Jake extended his hand, palm up, and waited. The silence stretched until it became unbearable for everyone except the two beings in the corral. Then, with movements as careful as a prayer, Diablo stepped forward and touched his muzzle to Jake's palm. The crowd erupted in amazed chatter, but Sterling's expression had shifted from confidence to something approaching concern. His $10 million bet suddenly seemed less certain than it had an hour ago. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Sterling ranch as word of the impossible wager spread like wildfire through the valley. By dawn, riders had carried the news to every homestead within 50 miles. Harrison Sterling had staked his entire fortune on a horse that had never been broken. Inside the ranch house's oak-paneled study, Sterling paced behind his mahogany desk, already second-guessing his alcohol-fueled decision. The stallion's savage screams echoed from the distant paddock, a constant reminder of what he'd committed himself to. 3 ranch hands had quit during the night, unwilling to witness what they called certain death. His foreman, Jake Morrison, knocked and entered without waiting for permission. The weathered cowboy's face bore the grim expression of a man delivering a death sentence. "Boss, we got ourselves a problem," Morrison said, removing his hat. "That horse kicked through 2 fence posts this morning. Nearly took young Billy's head clean off when he tried to refill the water trough." Sterling stopped pacing and fixed his steely gaze on Morrison. "Are you suggesting I back down from my own wager?" "I'm suggesting you ain't thinking straight. Nobody's gonna step forward for this fool's errand. That stallion's possessed by something unholy." Sterling moved to the window overlooking his vast property. Rolling hills dotted with prize cattle stretched to the horizon, testament to 3 generations of Sterling wealth and ambition. The thought of losing it all to his own hubris gnawed at him, but his pride ran deeper than his fear. "The bet stands," he declared. "Send word to town. I want every able-bodied man in the territory to know about this opportunity." By noon, curious onlookers began arriving at the ranch. They came in wagons and on horseback, drawn by the spectacle of watching either a miracle or a massacre. Sterling had his ranch hands set up wooden bleachers near the main corral, turning his desperate gamble into entertainment. The stallion commanded attention even from a distance. Black as midnight, with eyes that burned like coals, the horse moved with deadly grace around the reinforced pen. Every muscle rippled beneath his glossy coat as he tracked the movements of anyone who dared approach the fence line. "Jesus Almighty," whispered a local rancher named Peterson. "That ain't no regular horse. Look at the size of those hooves." Indeed, the stallion stood nearly 18 hands high, with a chest broad as a whiskey barrel and legs like tree trunks. Scars crisscrossed his flanks, evidence of countless battles with man and beast alike. When he reared up, pawing the air with iron-shod hooves, grown men stepped back involuntarily. Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived around 2 o'clock, his deputy trailing behind with obvious reluctance. Bradley had seen his share of violence in 20 years of law enforcement, but even he seemed unsettled by the atmosphere surrounding the ranch. "Harrison, this is madness," Bradley said, confronting Sterling near the house. "That animal's already killed 2 men in Denver. The previous owner sold him cheap just to get rid of the liability." Sterling's jaw tightened. He hadn't shared those particular details when purchasing the stallion. "Every horse can be broken, Tom. It just takes the right man. And if that man dies trying, Then he knew the risks. As afternoon wore on, several local cowboys made half-hearted attempts to approach the corral. Each one backed down after witnessing the stallion's fury up close. The horse seemed to sense their fear, becoming more agitated with each failed approach. His screams pierced the air like war cries, causing other horses in nearby paddocks to shy away nervously. Word continued spreading throughout the valley. Riders departed regularly to carry news to distant settlements, and Stallion began to realize the magnitude of what he'd set in motion. This wasn't just a local curiosity anymore. It was becoming a regional event that would define his reputation forever. As shadows lengthened toward evening, most of the crowd prepared to leave empty-handed. Stallion felt a mixture of relief and dread. If no one accepted the challenge, he could claim victory by default, but his reputation would suffer permanent damage. The territory would remember Harrison Stallion as the fool who made impossible bets. Morrison approached with the day's final head count. 43 men came to look, boss. Not one willing to step into that corral. Stallion nodded grimly, watching the last wagon disappear down the dusty road. Perhaps tomorrow would bring different results, though he doubted it. The stallion had made his violent nature abundantly clear to anyone with eyes to see. Just as Stallion turned to head inside, Morrison grabbed his arm. "Wait, someone's coming." A lone figure approached on foot from the eastern trail, moving with unhurried determination through the gathering dusk. Too far away to make out details, but something about the stranger's steady gait suggested this wasn't another curiosity seeker. Stallion squinted into the fading light, his pulse quickening. After a day of disappointments, could this finally be the man desperate enough to accept his impossible challenge? The morning sun cast long shadows across Stallin's estate as word of the impossible wager spread like wildfire through the valley. By dawn, riders had carried the news to every homestead, saloon, and trading post within 50 miles. Harrison Stallion, the man who owned half the territory and acted like he owned the other half, had finally made a bet he couldn't win. Marcus Thorne stood at his kitchen window, watching the dust clouds on the horizon as curious onlookers made their way toward the Stallion mansion. His coffee had gone cold in his weathered hands, but he barely noticed. The events of the previous evening played through his mind like a fever dream. Had he really stepped forward? Had he really accepted Stallin's challenge? The knock on his door came just after 8 o'clock. Marcus opened it to find a young boy, no more than 12, holding the reins of a sweating horse. "Mr. Thorne? Mr. Stallion sent me. He says you're to come at once. The whole territory's gathering to watch." Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "Tell Mr. Stallion I'll be along shortly." As the boy rode off, Marcus walked to his bedroom and knelt beside his bed. His hands shook slightly as he pulled out a wooden box from underneath the frame. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a pair of leather gloves unlike any others in the territory. The leather was soft as silk but strong as iron, and etched into each palm was a symbol that would have made most men cross themselves and run. He'd sworn never to use them again, sworn on his wife's grave that the old ways would die with him. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and losing his farm would mean losing the only thing left that connected him to her memory. The ride to Stallin's estate took 20 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. As Marcus approached the massive wrought-iron gates, he could see the crowd that had already assembled. Cowboys, farmers, businessmen, and gamblers had come from across the territory. Some sat in carriages, others on horseback, and many stood along the fence surrounding the largest corral on the property. Stallion waited near the gate, dressed in his finest suit despite the early hour. His smile was predatory as he spotted Marcus approaching. "Ah, our brave challenger arrives. I was beginning to wonder if you'd lost your nerve, Thorne." Marcus dismounted and tied his horse to the fence rail. "I gave you my word, Stallion. I keep my promises." "Admirable. though I confess I've been reconsidering the terms of our wager." Sterling's eyes glittered with malice. "A single farm seems rather modest stakes for such a momentous occasion. Perhaps we should—" "The terms stand as spoken," Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that made several nearby men step back instinctively. "Your entire estate against my farm, witnessed by everyone here." For a moment, something flickered in Sterling's eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear. But it passed quickly, replaced by his usual arrogance. "Very well. Let me introduce you to your opposition." Sterling led him toward a specially reinforced corral at the center of the property. The crowd parted as they approached, and Marcus heard the whispers following in their wake. Most of the spectators were betting men, already calculating odds and exchanging money. None of them believed the quiet farmer had any chance at all. The corral came into view, and Marcus felt his breath catch. The stallion was magnificent and terrible, a force of pure fury contained by nothing more than steel rails and wooden posts. Midnight's coat was black as a moonless night, and his eyes held an intelligence that was almost human and completely wild. The animal paced the perimeter of his prison, muscles rippling beneath his hide, occasionally striking the fence with hooves that sounded like thunder. "Beautiful, isn't he?" Sterling's voice held genuine admiration. "I bought him from a breeder in Colorado who claimed he was cursed. Nonsense, of course, but I admit the beast has proven challenging." Marcus studied the horse with eyes that saw more than most. There was something in the stallion's movements, something in the way he held his head, spoke of more than simple wildness. This animal had been broken once, badly, and the scars ran deeper than flesh. "He's afraid," Marcus said quietly. Sterling laughed. "Afraid? That monster has put 6 men in the hospital and killed one outright. If anything, we should be afraid of him." But Marcus was already slipping on his gloves, feeling the familiar tingle as the leather made contact with his skin. The symbols etched into the palms seemed to warm against his flesh, and for just a moment he could have sworn he heard his wife's voice on the wind. "Time to see what you're made of, farmer," Sterling announced, loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "The rules are simple. Stay on the horse for 8 seconds, and my estate is yours. Get thrown, trampled, or killed, and I'll be adding your little farm to my collection." Marcus stepped toward the gate, his heart pounding with a rhythm that matched the stallion's hoofbeats. The morning sun cast long shadows across Sterling's sprawling ranch as word of the bet spread like wildfire through the valley. By noon, spectators had begun gathering along the fence line of the main corral, their voices creating a low buzz of anticipation and skepticism. Harrison Sterling stood on his mansion's wraparound porch, surveying the growing crowd with satisfaction. This would be the entertainment of a lifetime, and when it was over, he'd have taught these simple folk a lesson about knowing their place. Thomas Whitmore arrived on foot, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and his weathered hat. The crowd parted as he walked through, some nodding respectfully, others whispering among themselves about the quiet farmer who dared challenge Sterling's monster. Martha Henderson, the schoolteacher, caught his arm as he passed. "Thomas, you don't have to do this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's no shame in walking away." He paused, his weathered hands adjusting the strap of his satchel. "Some things can't be walked away from, Martha. Some debts have to be paid." She searched his eyes, seeing something there she'd never noticed before, a darkness that seemed to swallow light. "What debt? Thomas, what aren't you telling us?" But he was already moving toward the corral where Diablo waited, his massive black form pacing like a caged storm. The stallion's ears lay flat against his skull, and foam flecked his muzzle as he tested the strength of the iron rails with his shoulder. Sterling descended from his porch with theatrical flair, his gold pocket watch catching the sunlight. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're about to witness the folly of false pride. Mr. Whitmore here believes he can succeed where dozens of professional horsebreakers have failed. He gestured grandly toward the corral. Diablo has hospitalized 7 men in the past 2 years. Perhaps our local farmer has some magical touch the rest of us lack. The crowd chuckled nervously, but Thomas paid them no attention. He approached the corral slowly, his movements deliberate and measured. As he drew closer, something remarkable happened. Diablo stopped pacing. The stallion's head lifted, nostrils flaring as he caught Thomas's scent on the wind. A low, rumbling sound emerged from the horse's chest. Not quite a whinny, not quite a growl. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Jake Morrison, the local blacksmith. "Never seen Diablo hold still for nobody before." Thomas reached the fence and stood motionless, studying the horse. Diablo approached cautiously, his massive hooves striking the packed earth with measured steps. The two regarded each other through the iron rails, and those closest to the fence fell silent, sensing they were witnessing something profound. "You remember, don't you, boy?" Thomas whispered, so quietly only the horse could hear. "You remember the smoke and the screaming? You remember what we did?" Diablo's ears pricked forward, and he extended his muzzle toward Thomas's outstretched hand. The touch was electric, recognition passing between man and beast like lightning across a storm-darkened sky. Sterling's confident smile began to waver. "What's he doing? Get in there and ride the beast." But Thomas continued his silent communion with the stallion, his hands moving slowly along the horse's neck, through the fence rails. From his satchel, he withdrew an object that made several spectators gasp, a cavalry bridle, its leather darkened with age and marked with the distinctive yellow stripe of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. "Sweet Jesus," breathed Doc Harrison, the town physician. "That's army gear, old army gear." Thomas opened the corral gate and stepped inside. The crowd collectively held its breath, waiting for Diablo to explode into violence. Instead, the stallion nuzzled Thomas's shoulder, a gesture so gentle it seemed impossible coming from the monster they all knew and feared. "Easy, Thunder," Thomas murmured, using a name that hadn't been spoken in 15 years. "Easy, old friend. We've both been running long enough." Sterling's face had gone pale. Something about the scene before him triggered a memory. A newspaper article he'd read years ago about a cavalry unit that had gone missing during the Indian Wars. He'd acquired Diablo from a horse trader who claimed the animal had been found wandering wild in the Montana Territory, scarred and mad with rage. As Thomas slipped the bridle over Diablo's head, the stallion stood perfectly still, transformed from a creature of violence into something almost reverent. The farmer swung onto the horse's back with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle, and together they moved around the corral in perfect harmony. The crowd erupted in amazement, but Thomas heard none of it. In his mind, he was 15 years younger, wearing blue wool and brass buttons, riding this same horse across a landscape painted with blood and smoke. He was remembering the day he'd lost everything that mattered, his honor, his unit, his faith in humanity. And now, impossibly, he'd found the one witness to his shame still alive, still carrying the same scars that marked his own soul. The real test was just beginning. The sun hung low over Sterling's estate as Daniel approached the corral where midnight waited. Word had spread faster than wildfire through town, and now a crowd of nearly 200 had gathered along the fence rails. Wealthy ranch owners sat in their carriages alongside shopkeepers and farmhands, all drawn by the spectacle of Sterling's impossible wager. Harrison Sterling stood near the gate, his polished boots catching the dying light. He'd spent the morning accepting side bets from eager spectators, his confidence growing with each handshake and exchange of money. The total now exceeded $50,000, more than most men would see in 3 lifetimes. "Still time to walk away, farmer," Sterling called out as Daniel entered the corral. "Save yourself the hospital bills." Daniel said nothing. His eyes were fixed on Midnight, who paced the far end of the enclosure like a caged demon. The stallion's black coat gleamed with sweat, and his ears lay flat against his skull. Fresh scratches marked the wooden rails where his hooves had struck in fury. The crowd fell silent as Daniel walked deeper into the corral, his movements slow and deliberate. He kept his hands visible, speaking in a voice so low that even those pressed against the fence couldn't make out the words. It sounded almost like singing, a rhythmic cadence that seemed to flow with the evening breeze. Midnight's ears twitched forward, then back again. The horse had never heard anything like this strange, hypnotic sound. Other men had entered his domain with whips and ropes, shouting commands and radiating fear-tinged aggression. This man was different. He carried no tools, bore no scent of desperation, and his voice held something that stirred a memory buried deep in the stallion's wild heart. "What's he doing?" whispered a woman in the crowd. "Damned if I know," muttered her husband. "But look at that horse." Midnight had stopped pacing. His massive head turned toward Daniel, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. The man was still 30 feet away, but something in his presence was affecting the stallion in ways that defied explanation. Daniel continued his approach, never breaking the rhythm of his voice. The words were in Lakota, learned during 3 brutal years when he'd been captured by a war party and lived among them as both prisoner and, eventually, reluctant student. Red Hawk, the medicine man who'd taken him under his wing, had taught him the old ways of speaking to wild things, horse whispering, the whites called it, though they understood nothing of its true power. Sterling shifted nervously. This wasn't going according to plan. The farmer should have been trampled by now, or at least thrown against the fence. Instead, Midnight seemed almost curious. "He's getting too close," Sterling muttered, then raised his voice. "Mind the beast doesn't kill you quick, farmer. I need witnesses to say you tried." But Daniel was beyond hearing human voices now. He'd slipped into the old trance state Red Hawk had taught him, where the boundary between man and animal grew thin. His breathing matched Midnight's, and his heartbeat slowed to match the great horse's rhythm. This was the secret the Lakota had guarded for generations, the ability to speak not with words, but with something deeper. 20 feet, 15, 10. Midnight's ears were fully forward now, his body language shifting from aggressive to alert. The crowd held its collective breath as Daniel extended his hand, palm up, fingers relaxed. The stallion stretched his neck forward, nostrils investigating this strange man who smelled of earth and carried no fear. The first touch was electric. Midnight's soft muzzle brushed Daniel's palm, and for a moment both man and horse stood frozen in that connection. Then the stallion pulled back, snorting and tossing his head, but he didn't retreat. "Impossible," Sterling breathed. Daniel began to move around the horse in a slow circle, his voice never wavering. Midnight turned to follow him, drawn by something he couldn't understand but couldn't resist. It was as if this man spoke a language the stallion had been born knowing but had never heard spoken aloud. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Daniel gradually closed the distance again. This time when he reached out, Midnight didn't pull away. The farmer's weathered hand stroked the stallion's neck, and incredibly the great horse leaned into the touch. "He's gentling him," someone whispered. "Sweet Jesus, he's actually gentling him." Sterling's face had gone pale beneath his tan. This wasn't supposed to happen. Midnight was his prize, his symbol of untamable power. No one was meant to succeed where he had failed. But as the sun touched the horizon, Daniel placed both hands on Midnight's neck and slowly, carefully, prepared to swing himself onto the stallion's back. The horse stood still as stone, his wild eyes calm for the first time since Sterling had owned him. The real test was about to begin. The dawn brought with it a tension that seemed to settle over Sterling's estate like morning frost. Word had spread through the county overnight about the bet, and by sunrise, carriages and riders were already gathering along the fence line of the main corral. Harrison Sterling stood on his mansion's wraparound porch, coffee in hand, watching the growing crowd with satisfaction. This would be a spectacle worthy of his reputation. Thomas Brennan had arrived before first light, but he hadn't come to the main corral. Instead, he'd made his way to the smaller paddock where Diablo was kept, away from the gathering spectators. The black stallion stood in the far corner, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian, nostrils flaring as he sensed the unusual activity beyond his enclosure. "Easy, boy," Thomas whispered, his voice carrying an odd familiarity. "I know you remember." The horse's ears pricked forward at the sound, and for a moment the perpetual wildness in his dark eyes seemed to flicker with something else. Recognition, perhaps, or confusion. Margaret Sterling emerged from the mansion's side door, her face pale but determined. She'd barely slept, haunted by the certainty that she was about to witness either a miracle or a tragedy. As she approached the corral where the crowd was gathering, she noticed her husband's obvious pleasure at the turnout. "Quite the audience you've assembled, Harrison," she said, unable to keep the disapproval from her voice. "A man should have witnesses when he's proven right," Harrison replied, straightening his vest. "When that farmer gets himself killed trying to mount Diablo, every person here will know that Harrison Sterling doesn't make empty boasts." Sheriff Conway pushed through the crowd, his weathered face grim. He'd seen too many good men destroyed by pride and horses to take any pleasure in the morning's events. Behind him walked Doc Henley, his medical bag in hand, a precaution everyone hoped wouldn't be needed, but nobody questioned. "Sterling," the sheriff called out, "you sure about this? That horse has put 3 men in the ground already." Harrison's smile was cold as winter steel. "The terms were clear, Sheriff. If Thomas Brennan can ride Diablo for 10 minutes without being thrown, he wins my estate. If he can't—" He shrugged eloquently. At the smaller paddock, Thomas had removed his hat and coat, moving with deliberate slowness. His hands, calloused from years of farm work, trembled slightly as he reached for the gate latch. The tremor wasn't from fear, it was from memory. "Thomas Brennan," he murmured to himself, testing the name on his lips. It still felt foreign after all these years of wearing it like an ill-fitting coat. The gate swung open with a creak that seemed to echo across the morning air. Diablo's head shot up, and he pawed the ground, but he didn't charge. Instead, the stallion watched with an intensity that bordered on human, as if trying to solve a puzzle that had haunted him for years. Thomas stepped into the paddock, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Even the growing crowd sensed something significant was happening, though they couldn't see the smaller enclosure from their position at the main corral. "You know me, don't you?" Thomas said softly, moving closer. "You remember the man who broke you the first time? The man who taught you to hate the touch of human hands?" The stallion's nostrils flared, drinking in the scent that memory told him should be familiar, but time had altered. Thomas reached slowly into his shirt pocket and withdrew something small, a piece of dried apple, saved from his breakfast days ago. "I was younger then," Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Angrier. I thought breaking a horse meant breaking its spirit." He held out the apple on his palm. "I was wrong about a lot of things back then." Diablo took a tentative step forward, then another. The apple disappeared in a quick, almost violent bite, but the horse didn't retreat. Instead, he stood close enough that Thomas could see the old scars along his neck, marks left by a heavy hand and harsh methods. "I'm sorry," Thomas whispered, and the words carried the weight of 15 years of regret. "I'm so damned sorry." From the main corral came the sound of Harrison's voice, impatient and commanding. "Bring the horse! The sun's up and my guests are waiting." 3 ranch hands approached the paddock with ropes and poles, ready to drive Diablo to the main arena. But as they drew near, they stopped in amazement. the legendary killer horse, stood calmly beside the quiet farmer, Thomas's hand resting gently on his neck. "Well, I'll be damned," one of them breathed. Thomas looked up at them, his face set with grim determination. "Take us to Stallion," he said. "It's time to finish what I started 15 years ago." The crowd's excited chatter died to whispers as they saw the procession approaching, man and horse walking side by side, neither rope nor halter between them. The morning sun cast long shadows across Sterling's estate as Thomas made his way to the stables, each step heavier than the last. Word had spread through the valley like wildfire. Today was the day the quiet farmer would attempt what dozens of others had failed to do. Carriages lined the main road, filled with spectators who had traveled from neighboring counties to witness what many believed would be Thomas Mitchell's final moments. Harrison Stallion stood at the paddock fence, his silk vest pristine despite the early hour. The weight of potential ruin showed only in the slight tremor of his hands as he gripped his pocket watch. Around him, a crowd of wealthy ranchers and townsfolk gathered, their conversations a mixture of anticipation and morbid curiosity. "Still time to back down, Mitchell," Stallion called out, though his voice lacked its usual commanding tone. "No shame in admitting you've bitten off more than you can chew." Thomas paused at the gate, his weathered hands steady as he worked the latch. "Already come this far," he replied quietly, not meeting Sterling's eyes. The truth weighed heavy in his chest, that this moment had been inevitable since the day he'd first laid eyes on Tempest 3 years ago. Dr. Henley stood ready with his medical bag, positioned strategically near the paddock entrance. The local minister had arrived unbidden, his presence adding an ominous gravity to the proceedings. Even Sarah Mitchell had come, despite Thomas's protests, her face pale but determined as she watched from the crowd. The black stallion emerged from the shadows of the stable like a creature born from nightmares. Tempest's coat gleamed in the morning light, muscles rippling beneath skin that bore the scars of countless battles. His eyes, wild and intelligent, swept across the gathered crowd before fixing on Thomas with an intensity that made several spectators step backward. "Sweet Jesus," someone whispered. "That's no ordinary horse." Thomas entered the paddock alone, carrying nothing but a worn rope halter. The gate clanged shut behind him with the finality of a prison door. The crowd fell silent, even the birds seeming to sense the gravity of the moment. Tempest pawed the ground, sending up clouds of dust that caught the morning light. The stallion's nostrils flared as he caught Thomas's scent, and something flickered in those dark eyes. Not recognition exactly, but a stirring of memory that ran deeper than conscious thought. "Easy now," Thomas murmured, his voice carrying across the still air. He moved with deliberate slowness, each gesture calculated to project calm authority. "Easy, Thunder." The old name slipped out unbidden, and Tempest's ears pricked forward. Several people in the crowd exchanged puzzled glances, but Thomas was lost now in the moment, in memories that threatened to overwhelm him. The stallion took a tentative step forward, then another. His massive head lowered slightly, and Thomas could see the intelligence behind the wildness, the hurt that had driven this magnificent creature to violence. It was the same hurt that had haunted Thomas's dreams for 3 long years. "I know, boy," Thomas whispered, extending his hand palm up. "I know what they did to you. To us." Stallion leaned forward against the fence, his knuckles white. Around him, the crowd pressed closer, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. The air itself seemed charged with possibility and danger. Tempest snorted, a sound that held both warning and something else, a note of longing that only Thomas seemed to understand. The farmer took another step forward, and the stallion didn't retreat. Instead, he stretched his neck forward, nostrils working to catch more of Thomas's scent. "That's it," Thomas breathed. "Remember me, Thunder. Remember how it used to be." The stallion's muzzle brushed against Thomas's outstretched palm, soft as a whisper. For a moment, The wildness faded from his eyes, replaced by something achingly familiar. But then a shout from the crowd broke the spell, and Tempest reared back, striking out with hooves that could crush a man's skull. Thomas didn't flinch. He stood his ground as the massive animal towered above him, death balanced on razor's edge. "I should have come for you sooner," he said, his voice steady despite the tears that threatened. "I should never have let them take you." The stallion's hooves crashed down inches from Thomas's shoulders, but the farmer remained motionless. In that moment of perfect stillness, something passed between man and horse, an understanding forged in shared loss and tempered by time. Slowly, carefully, Thomas raised the halter. Tempest watched every movement, muscles coiled for flight or fight. The crowd held its collective breath as the rope settled over the stallion's ears, then gasped in amazement as the great horse lowered his head in submission. But Thomas knew this was only the beginning. The real test, mounting this creature that had killed and maimed, still lay ahead, and with it, the moment when all his carefully guarded secrets would finally come to light. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Sterling estate as word spread like wildfire through the surrounding counties. By dawn, carriages and riders had begun arriving, drawn by rumors of the impossible, that someone had actually succeeded in taming Sterling's devil horse. The news had traveled faster than anyone could have imagined, carrying whispers of the quiet farmer who had done what no man before him could accomplish. Harrison Sterling stood at his study window, watching the growing crowd with a mixture of dread and fascination. His hands trembled as he gripped his morning coffee, the bitter taste doing nothing to wash away the bile rising in his throat. Everything he had built, everything he owned, now belonged to a man whose very existence threatened to unravel secrets Sterling had buried for decades. In the stable yard, Thomas moved with the same quiet confidence he had displayed the day before, brushing down the black stallion as if it were any ordinary horse. The animal stood perfectly still, occasionally nuzzling Thomas's shoulder with an affection that seemed to defy nature itself. Spectators pressed against the fence, their voices a constant buzz of amazement and speculation. How did he do it? Never seen anything like it in my life. That horse tried to kill 3 men just last week. Thomas paid them no attention, his focus entirely on the magnificent creature before him. But Sterling could see something else in the farmer's demeanor, a tension that hadn't been there during yesterday's demonstration. The man's eyes occasionally flicked toward the house, and Sterling recognized the look of someone carrying a burden too heavy to bear alone. As the crowd continued to swell, Sterling's business partner, Cornelius Wade, burst through the study door without ceremony. His face was flushed with exertion and panic. "Harrison, you can't go through with this," Wade gasped, loosening his collar. "Do you have any idea what you're about to lose? The land alone is worth more than most men see in 10 lifetimes." Sterling didn't turn from the window. "The bet was made in front of witnesses, Cornelius. There's no backing out now. Then challenge the legitimacy. There has to be some way." "You think I haven't considered every angle?" Sterling's voice carried a weariness that surprised even himself. The man fulfilled his end of the bargain. "Honor demands I fulfill mine." Wade moved to stand beside his partner, studying the scene below. "There's something not right about this whole situation. That farmer, where did he come from? What do we really know about him?" Sterling's jaw tightened. He knew far more about Thomas than he had revealed to anyone, and that knowledge sat like a stone in his chest. "Sometimes the past has a way of collecting what it's owed, Cornelius." Down in the yard, Thomas had finished grooming the stallion and was now leading it through a series of simple exercises. The horse responded to the slightest pressure from his hands, the smallest shift in his posture. It was poetry in motion, a dance between man and beast that seemed to transcend the natural order. But as Thomas worked, memories flooded through him with each gentle touch of the horse's neck. Memories of another black stallion, of a burning barn, of choices made in desperation that had haunted him for 23 years. The horse beneath his hands now was magnificent, powerful, alive. Everything that the horse in his past was no longer. A commotion near the estate's main gate drew everyone's attention. A dust cloud announced the arrival of more carriages, these bearing the unmistakable marks of wealth and authority. Sterling's face went pale as he recognized several members of the territorial legislature, a federal judge, and, most troubling of all, Marshal Jacob Thornfield. The marshal's presence changed everything. Thornfield was known throughout the territory as a man who left no stone unturned, no question unanswered. His arrival suggested this gathering had attracted attention from quarters Sterling had never anticipated. Thomas saw the marshal too, and for the first time since arriving at the estate, his composure cracked slightly. His hand stilled on the stallion's neck, and the horse, sensing his sudden tension, snorted and shifted nervously. Sterling made a decision that surprised even himself. He strode from his study, through the grand hallways of the house that would soon no longer be his, and out into the yard. The crowd parted before him, their conversations dying to hushed whispers. "Thomas!" Sterling called out, his voice carrying across the space between them. The farmer turned, and for a moment their eyes met with an understanding that transcended the simple terms of their wager. Both men carried secrets. Both had lived with the weight of the past, and both knew that the events of the next few hours would determine not just the ownership of an estate, but the fate of truths that had been buried far too long. The black stallion stood between them, magnificent and calm, a living symbol of the impossible made real, and, perhaps, of redemption that had been 23 years in the making. The morning sun cast long shadows across the corral as the entire town gathered in hushed anticipation. Harrison Sterling stood at the fence, his face pale beneath his usually commanding demeanor. The violent stallion, Diablo, paced restlessly in the center of the ring, his black coat gleaming with perspiration and fury. Jacob Whitmore approached the gate slowly, his weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. The quiet farmer had shed his usual homespun clothes for something more practical, leather chaps and a worn vest that spoke of a different life, one he'd tried desperately to leave behind. "Last chance to walk away, Whitmore," Sterling called out, though his voice lacked its usual arrogance. The millionaire's entire fortune hung in the balance, but something in the farmer's eyes told him this was about more than money now. Jacob paused at the gate, his gaze finding Sarah in the crowd. Her face was etched with worry, but she nodded encouragingly. She alone knew the full truth of who he'd been before he became the gentleman who tended crops and mended fences. "Some horses aren't broken by force," Jacob said quietly, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "They're healed by understanding." He stepped into the corral, and immediately Diablo's attention fixed on him. The stallion's nostrils flared, sensing something different about this man. Where others had brought whips and ropes, Jacob carried only himself. The crowd fell silent as Jacob began to move in a slow circle around the perimeter. He didn't look directly at Diablo, didn't make any aggressive motions. Instead, he seemed to be reading the animal's every breath, every muscle twitch. "Easy now," Jacob murmured, his voice carrying authority that surprised even those who thought they knew him. "I see you, boy. I know what they've done to you." Diablo snorted and pawed the ground, but something in the man's tone gave him pause. This wasn't the voice of someone who meant harm. Jacob began to speak, his words floating across the corral like a gentle current. He talked about pain, about the way it could twist a soul until trust became impossible. He spoke of scars that couldn't be seen, and the long journey back to believing that not all hands brought suffering. As he talked, Jacob slowly decreased the size of his circle. Diablo watched him warily, but the stallion's aggressive posturing began to fade. The rigid arch of his neck softened slightly, and his ears, which had been pinned back in constant anger, began to twitch forward. "That's it," Jacob whispered. "You're starting to remember, aren't you? Remember what it was like before the fear?" The crowd barely dared to breathe as Jacob extended his hand, palm up, fingers relaxed. Diablo approached cautiously, then shied away, then approached again. Each time Jacob remained perfectly still, patient as stone. Sterling gripped the fence rail so tightly his knuckles went white. His fortune, his estate, his very identity were all riding on this moment. But as he watched the farmer work, something shifted in his understanding. This wasn't about domination or breaking spirits. This was about connection. "You know what it's like, don't you?" Diablo seemed to sense the deeper truth in Jacob's words. To be angry at the world, to strike out, because striking first feels safer than waiting to be hurt again. Jacob's hand touched Diablo's muzzle, and the stallion didn't pull away. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, but Jacob's focus never wavered from the magnificent animal before him. "But here's what I learned," Jacob continued, his hand moving slowly to stroke Diablo's neck. "Anger only makes the cage smaller. Trust, that's what sets you free." In one fluid motion, Jacob placed his hands on Diablo's back and swung himself up. The stallion tensed, every muscle coiled for explosion, but Jacob's presence was different from every other rider. There was no demand for submission, no attempt at conquest. Instead, there was partnership. Diablo took a tentative step, then another. Jacob moved with him, becoming part of the horse's rhythm rather than fighting against it. Together, they moved around the corral in perfect harmony, man and beast united in mutual respect. The crowd erupted in amazement, but Sterling stood frozen. He'd lost everything: his estate, his fortune, his arrogant certainty about the world. Yet watching Jacob and Diablo together, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: humility. Jacob brought Diablo to a gentle stop and dismounted. He stroked the stallion's neck one final time, whispering words only the horse could hear, then walked toward the gate. "The horse is yours, Whitmore," Sterling said quietly. "As is everything I own." Jacob shook his head. "I don't want your estate, Sterling. I want something more valuable." "What's that?" Jacob smiled, looking toward Sarah, toward the life he'd built through patience and genuine connection. "I want you to learn what I learned. Some things can't be taken by force. They can only be given freely." As the crowd dispersed, Diablo stood calmly in the corral, no longer the violent stallion of legend, but simply a horse who had remembered how to trust.